We are returning from the break and getting ready for our next session.
Welcome back, everyone. So for this next session, we have actually one of our teammates, Sarita from SEI, to present on this next portion. And I'll pass it to you, Lights, to introduce yourself and get us set up.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for doing such a great job presenting pronouncing my first and last name. That's really impressive, and you didn't even ask me how to do it beforehand, so props for that. I've been working at SEI for around 10 months now. Before that, I did a couple of masters in Europe, one focused on political ecology, degrowth, and environmental justice, and the other one focused on international environmental studies. So hoping to bring some of our curriculum here at SEI and combine that with some of the topics I learned about there, and excited to share with you today. So the presentation is divided into 4 main sections, and each section has a tool associated with it that we're going to use to explore some of the data related to that subject. And the final section will be a chance for you to explore one of these tools and discuss in small groups. So I'm going to be asking for a little help with maybe with the breakout rooms when we get to that stage. So we'll go ahead and get started. Start off by zooming out and looking at the big picture. Geologists have recently determined that we have left the Holocene epoch. Holocene epoch, you can see it over here on the screen. It's a period characterized by a remarkably stable climate. It's lasted around 10,000 years, and it coincides with the rise of agriculture and complex civilization. So anatomically modern humans have been around for about 100,000 years, but many of us started growing plants and building civilizations all over the world at roughly the same time. And it's probably because the climate was finally predictable. You can see here how predictable it was in comparison to the past 100,000 years. But we have now entered the Anthropocene, and that's the epoch where humans are the main driving force impacting the Earth system. And we don't really know what impacts that will have on the biosphere, our ability to continue to grow food and power complex civilization. When exactly the Holocene ended is still under debate, but most place it between the first industrial revolution and the end of World War II. And we can see here the acceleration of socioeconomic trends like population, GDP, and energy use, driving Earth system trends like global warming, forest loss, ocean acidification, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. It's important to point out that our economic activity is directly linked to the use of both energy and material resources, and those are associated with these global and local environmental impacts. And for example, we're going to be talking a little bit more about air pollution later in this presentation. So local air pollution can cause damage to our own health and bodies, while global air pollution in the form of greenhouse gases is threatening the health of the biosphere. Also important to note that the positive and negative impacts of these changes have been unequally distributed both within countries and between countries, leading to calls for environmental and social justice, which we'll also get more into later in the presentation. So what exactly do I mean by health of the biosphere? Scientists have identified 9 planetary boundaries, which define a safe operating space for humanity. And the take-home message here is really that it's not just about climate change. We like to talk a lot about climate change, and it is very important, but the impacts of the Great Acceleration have led to multiple ecological crises, ranging from the 6th mass extinction to the breakdown of nutrient cycles, which we depend on to grow our food. Important to point out that these boundaries are interconnected, and they're characterized by both feedback loops and tipping points. So what does that mean? One example of a feedback loop is when the planet warms, ice melts. Normally, ice is reflecting sunlight off the Earth. That's known as the albedo effect. But as more and more ice melts, less and less heat is reflected back off the Earth, causing the planet to rise, temperature to rise again, leading to more ice melting. So this is what we call a feedback loop. Another example is methane released from Arctic permafrost, right? As the more it warms, the more methane is released, the more warming we get. And once that reaches a certain threshold, we can call it a tipping point. Even if we stop burning fossil fuels, the ice isn't going to come back and reflect that heat. The permafrost will continue to release methane. No one knows exactly where these tipping points are, but scientists make their best guesses, represented in the diagram above. 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature rise is perhaps the most famous tipping point, widely recognized by the scientific community. And we're now at 1.3 degrees, and it seems like it's rising almost 0.1 degree a year. Meanwhile, how are they interconnected, right? Climate change also influences extinction rates and biodiversity integrity, another planetary boundary. Land system change is actually the largest driver of biodiversity loss, also influencing and influenced by climate change, right? Cutting down a forest can cause loss of habitat for species locally, while also contributing to climate change, leading to greater pressure on species globally. So with that in mind, let's take a look at some different strategies for addressing these interconnected planetary boundaries and associated ecological crises. In recent history, progress has more or less been defined as economic growth, the idea that we need to keep increasing production and consumption continually in order to make our lives better. Green growth refers to economic growth that's also environmentally and socially sustainable. And a common model that I think you've probably all seen for visualizing this, you can see at the bottom left-hand side of the screen here, is this Venn diagram that depicts three discrete but interlocking systems that can coexist and intersect harmoniously. Proponents of degrowth argue that this visualization downplays the importance of understanding the physical limits of our planet, both to supply resources and also absorb waste. Their model, which you can see on the right-hand side, is quite different. It depicts the economy as a part of our society, which is in turn a part of the environment. And degrowth proponents will often question whether it's possible or desirable for production and consumption to continue to grow indefinitely. And they argue that we can live better lives while using less energy and material resources. So there's a lot of debates between these groups. I'm not going to go through each one of them too much here, but I did provide a resource so you can look into each one of the individual ones if you're interested. So green growth really focusing on improving efficiency, while the degrowth side points out rebound effects. So as the price of something goes down, our use of that thing actually usually goes up rather than down. You can imagine a car becomes more fuel efficient, but maybe we drive more miles or buy a bigger car. That would be a direct rebound effect. An indirect rebound effect occurs when the savings from the decrease in price from one product is reinvested into a different product. And this paradox actually points to a fundamental choice we have as a society. As we become more efficient, do we choose to invest those productivity gains in more production and consumption? Or do we instead prefer to produce and consume the same as before and have more free time to enjoy with our friends and family? Degrowth, the green growth paradigm focusing really heavily on market-based solutions. So for example, buying and trading carbon offsets so that companies in the global north can continue to pollute as long as they pay some money to prevent pollution somewhere else. One of the most common schemes for this is called REDD, or reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. And there's a long history of environmental justice groups, and in this case, the Indigenous Environmental Network, speaking out against these new commodifications of nature. They actually rebrand the acronym as reaping profits from evictions, land grabs, deforestation, and destruction of biodiversity. And as I said, this is representing an even larger divide between grassroots environmental justice organizations and mainstream environmentalism. And it can really be witnessed at protests outside of the COP27 going on right now, but at every COP event, there's many rich corporations on the inside and then environmental justice groups on the outside, sort of banging their fists on the door. Another difference we see is green growth looking for technical innovation, while degrowth is looking at system or lifestyle change. Green growth looking for a managerial solution that the smartest people in the room can come together and figure this out. Whereas degrowth really emphasizing direct democracy. We need citizens' assemblies where ordinary people make decisions. We need worker-owned cooperatives rather than shareholder corporations. But perhaps the biggest disagreement, you can see it in the name, is that green growth thinks that GDP should always rise. Nearly all political parties in the world agree on this. Democrats, Republicans, the UN Sustainable Development Goals actually agree as well. They think our economy should rise 2% each year, which means it would double in size every 36 years. And green growth advocates argue that we can decouple or separate growth from environmental harms by reducing the amount of energy and material resources we're using while still growing our economy. The degrowth community would point out that GDP measures both good and bad things equally. If I buy a beer or get access to healthcare, this contributes to GDP, and these are both good things. But if there's an oil spill and we have to clean it up, if we privatize prisons, if we militarize the police force, or if we drop some bombs in another country, this also contributes to GDP. We also know that GDP has been rising in the US pretty much every year, while quality of life and wages for most Americans have been stagnant for decades due to rising inequality. So GDP may not be useful for measuring our progress as a society, but it is closely linked to our use of energy and material resources, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. And there's no evidence that decoupling is happening fast enough to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change, biodiversity loss, and other ecological impacts. If you're interested in learning more about degrowth, recommend this video down here at the bottom. So what should replace GDP? If you agree with me that maybe it's not the best metric for us to use, maybe you're wondering how we can use energy and material resources in order to satisfy our basic needs while staying within the limits of the planet. And one way of thinking about this is called donut economics, introduced by Kate Raworth. And you can see on the image on the inner circle here, it's social thresholds. So you can see education, health, food, all of these things we want to have access to. And you can also measure the progress of a society by looking at how many social thresholds have they attained: food, water, healthcare, democratic equality, things like that. The outer ring represents biophysical boundaries. So over a certain level of production and consumption can lead to the transgression of these boundaries, and they include metrics from the planetary boundaries framework that we introduced earlier, things like biodiversity loss, climate change, stuff like that. And the space in the middle, also known as the donut, represents the safe and just operating space for humanity, where basic needs can be met without endangering the integrity of the Earth system. Video from Kate Raworth introducing that concept. So this is now I'm going to introduce you to the first tool we're going to use today. One recent study looks at most countries in the world and sees how they stack up at meeting basic needs without overshooting ecological limits. So the model actually illustrates that currently no country meets the basic needs of its residents at a globally sustainable level of resource use. And in general, countries fall into one of the two categories you can see on the screen here. One in which the country satisfies the majority of the basic needs of its citizens, but consumes far more than its fair share of resources. That's the image on the left over here, A, and then over here, B, we can see a country that consumes hardly any resources at all, but is not able to meet the basic needs of its citizens. So I would argue that a more equitable distribution of resources is necessary if we're going to achieve a decent standard of living for all within the limits of the planet. So yeah, this is one of the tools that we're going to give you a chance to explore at the end here. I just opened up the link that will be shared with you. You can choose any countries and look at how they stack up to all of these social thresholds and planetary boundaries that we've been discussing. Sorry, I'm just looking for the US here. And then they have all the actual metrics down below. So per capita boundary for carbon emissions measured in tons of CO2. What is the consumption-based emissions in the US? What is it in Bangladesh, the two countries that we're comparing right now? Quick word here on consumption-based emissions. There's two ways of measuring emissions, carbon emissions. One is looking at consumption, how much we consume, including what we import from other countries. The other one is called territorial emissions and only looks at the emissions within a country. Here we're looking at consumption-based emissions, which I would argue is a much fairer way of thinking about emissions, but unfortunately, most international agencies use production-based or territorial emissions rather. So with that, getting back into some air quality basics. So now we just looked at the big picture. Now we're going to narrow in on air quality, which I hope we can think of as like a case study for integrating what we've thought about in this larger picture. Yeah, starting with some basics about air quality. What is the atmosphere? Here's what it's made of. It's actually a layer of gases retained by the Earth's gravitational pull. Allows for all life on Earth by regulating temperature, protecting us from UV light, and also creating pressure, which allows for the existence of water. 99% nitrogen and oxygen, a little bit of water, and particulate matter, ozone, argon. And of course, there's also greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, which now have reached over 419 parts per million. Pollutants are generally placed into one of four categories based on their source, shown in the image to the left. So that includes natural sources like wildfires and volcanoes, area-based sources like agriculture and land use change. For example, raising plants and animals produces emissions, and so does cutting down forest or draining a wetland in order to have that farmland. Third is stationary sources like factories and buildings, and the fourth is mobile sources like airplanes and cars. And I included this other picture here on the side of the screen about life cycle assessment, because I think it's really important when we think about pollutants, like the one shows on the screen, to think about the full environmental impact, like emissions or water use or whatever it is we want to measure for of a product, not only the use phase of that product. So here on the left, we can pretty much only see the use phase, and that's all we really see in our daily lives as well. But in fact, to build a car or to build anything, we need to mine and process metals. We need to manufacture the various components as well as the entire vehicle. We need to account for the fuel source before we can begin to consider what we call tailpipe emissions or the use phase. And then we must also consider disposal or end of life. So you could say that the energy or the pollution from each stage of this chain is embodied in the final product. And many of these processes take place outside of the US. So impacts happening outside of the country as well. From this perspective, while an electric car may produce less emissions per mile traveled than a conventional car, it's certainly not zero emissions. That's an advertising term, and I would hope you all avoid using it. The auto industry knows this, but they're really happy to take advantage of the current regulatory focus on tailpipe emissions that you can see here displayed in this image. In terms of other environmental impacts like particulate matter or toxic waste, electric cars may actually be more harmful than traditional cars. Switching to an electric car improves the air quality where the car is driven during the use phase, but creates more pollutants in other countries where the lithium is mined, where the battery is manufactured. So a greener solution would include not only a shift in technology, but also how society functions. In this case, moving away from single occupancy vehicles towards public and active transport. For more on life cycle assessment, I recommend the short documentary, The Story of Stuff. And for more about an in-depth life cycle assessment of electric and gas cars, I recommend this article of Perro et al. 2018, which is linked at the end of the presentation. Sorry, all these videos I want to play as I go along. So here we can see 6 common air pollutants, which are harmful to human health. Some impacts include respiratory disease, reproductive health, neurological impacts, among others. They are transmitted through air, land, and water and end up in our bodies, as you can see in the other image here. The main source of the pollutants is combustion, so fossil fuels and waste. Agriculture and land use change, construction, these also play a major role. You may be surprised that greenhouse gases are not included here, knowing how dangerous they are in driving climate change. It's because in this taxonomy, we're focusing on pollutants which directly harm human health. For example, breathing in a toxic substance that impacts the internal organs, where greenhouse gases have indirect effects. Right. But of course, these two categories of pollutant can interact. So climate change increases the risk of wildfire, which in turn can create local air pollutants and also continue to release greenhouse gas emissions, contributing to climate change. So we can see how all of these things are connected. I'm going to introduce the second tool now. It's an interactive map where we can explore real-time data from air quality monitors across the world. Some questions to keep in mind while viewing the map. Where are people mainly suffering from poor air quality? And who is consuming the goods and services produced in these regions? And finally, where do we send our waste when we're done with it? Do we deal with it all here, or does it end up somewhere else? And can we maybe see that in the map here? So yeah, as I mentioned, there's air quality monitors all over the world. We can see most of the worst air quality really taking place in these regions. If we click on, sorry, it's going a little crazy here. If we click on any individual one, it will show what the air quality has been for the past months, and a little bit more information about that PM and NO2 here. And yeah, you can also click for more information from that specific air quality monitoring site. Again, this is showing air quality monitoring sites around the world. So I invite you to explore that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. With that in mind, some basics, let's talk about air quality and environmental justice. Many people will be surprised to learn that air pollution kills more people annually than COVID-19 has since the start of the pandemic. We might ask ourselves why this problem doesn't receive more attention, and the answer may lie in the words of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, who explains that this is a product of racism, colonialism, and classism. The majority of people dying from exposure to toxic substances are poor people and people of color living in low and middle income countries who are simply below the radar screen for far too many people. And with that in mind, let's talk a little bit more about air quality and environmental justice and explore some maps to investigate these issues further. Now that we understand how air quality impacts human health in a basic way, let's talk about environmental justice and how these impacts of poor air quality disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color. Environmental justice was born as a slogan for the first time in the US in the 1980s among Black and Latino communities. They were mobilizing against injustices in their communities perpetrated by polluting industries and waste disposal facilities. There are generally 3 recognized pillars of environmental justice. This includes distribution, so equally distributing environmental goods, things like parks and education facilities, and also BADs, so toxic waste sites and polluting facilities, things like that. How are these things distributed? The second one, process, so fair planning and decision-making process that involves the impacted communities. This is also sometimes referred to as prior and informed consent. And the third, representation, so meaningful involvement and legitimate representation in that decision-making process. The images we see on the screen here depict both national and global environmental justice conflicts, and probably you're already aware, both within the US and internationally, it's the groups least responsible for both air pollution and climate change who are going to feel the greatest impacts. One way to explore environmental justice conflicts around the world is to use the EJ Atlas. As resources needed to fuel our economy move through the commodity chain from extraction, processing, and disposal, at each stage, environmental impacts are externalized onto the most marginalized populations. Often it takes place far away from the eyes of concerned citizens or consumers of that end product. So the EJ Atlas collects these stories from communities struggling for environmental justice all around the world. It aims to make their mobilization more visible and create the case for true corporate and state accountability for these injustices. It also serves as a space for those working in environmental justice issues to get information, find other groups working on related issues. So with that in mind, I'll open up the Environmental Justice Atlas here. I will warn you, I have a few maps open on the screen, and this one has been very slow to load for me. So hopefully it will be able to come up. Oh, there it is. But yeah, moving a little bit slowly. So if you click here, you can find a lot more information about the Atlas. It's a work in progress, so anyone can actually contribute case studies to the Environmental Justice Atlas. I highly recommend, if you know about an environmental justice struggle going on, check out if it's already there. If not, see if people who are involved in that would like you to contribute that struggle to the Atlas. So this is definitely something I recommend you all explore some conflicts. And here you can see what types of different conflicts are included. Yeah, definitely recommend you checking that out and maybe even contributing some cases of your own. There's an editing process, and it's something great to put on your resume too. Hey, I contributed this case to the EJ Atlas. You can check it out online. It's being used by professionals. So yeah, something to think about. So now that we have that global picture in mind, let's take a look at our own society. So in the US, you may already know people with low income and people of color are more likely than white people to live near high air pollution areas, such as freeway interchanges, ports, airways, toxic release sites. And because of this, they're also more likely to suffer related health problems like asthma, cardiovascular disease, and low birth weight. On the other hand, people with low income and people of color are less likely to live near areas with access to good education, food options, green spaces, libraries, and other economic opportunities. And this is partly because residents don't have the resources to move to cleaner and more desirable areas, and partly because residents don't have the power to prevent polluting industries, highways, or waste dumps from locating in their neighborhoods. And again, unlike CO2 emissions that have global environmental consequences, the impacts of local air pollution is more site-specific, although they are produced by many of the same activities. So you're probably asking yourself, how did we get here? Or maybe you already know the answer. We have to look to the past, right? The US was founded as a white settler colony and built on enslavement and dispossession of people of color. Until the 1860s, this was explicitly the case, and only whites could be citizens. Blacks were allowed citizenship in the 1860s. Other people of color were actually allowed citizenship far later than that, Native Americans in 1924, Asians in 1952. And as this was happening, new laws and policies were springing up to enforce segregation, widely referred to as the Jim Crow laws. In the 1930s, the Home Owners Loan Corporation, which is a government-funded New Deal program, created maps that ranked neighborhoods largely on their racial makeup and income of residents. So majority white areas were marked as desirable, while areas with large populations of African Americans or Latinx were colored red and considered high risk for mortgage lenders. And that made it next to impossible for families to get loans or buy homes outside of the area where they've been prescribed to live. This had very serious consequences, expanding residential segregation and racial inequality after World War II through government subsidized suburban sprawl on the one hand and urban disinvestment on the other hand. The economic and racial segregation created by this redlining persists today, and you can see the outcomes in San Diego using this interactive map. I'm not going to take the time to open it up now because we don't have so much time, but you can look at neighborhoods where they were ranked and where they are on a social vulnerability scale now. So really seeing from then to now how it's changed. This is a tool for San Diego. I was working in San Diego for the past few months, so that's why I had it on hand. Do feel like it's important to point out that on a global scale, the nation state is the ultimate form of redlining, right? Disallowing communities in the global south whose livelihoods are destroyed by climate change or the activity of international corporations to move to another country. Similar to local environmental justice movements, the climate justice movement points out that it's those who have contributed least to global warming who are hardest hit by the impacts and who are not getting an ability to move on from that. With that in mind, let's move back to the present and discuss our final tool, CalEnviroScreen, which stands for California Communities Environmental Health Screening Tool. It's an ArcGIS map, and it shows the impacts of environmental and socioeconomic burdens on communities in California. And it really uses data to quantify how much specific communities are impacted. And then it uses this to calculate a score based on each community's percentile. So that's in relation to other communities in California. If a community has a high score, it means that community has a higher environmental and socioeconomic burden. The higher the score, the redder the community appears on the map. You can see the map on the side of the screen here, and you probably notice the middle of California looking very red, very high score, high pollution and socioeconomic burden compared to the coast. You probably know this is the Central Valley, and it's a classic example of a rural periphery that's supporting an urban core. And maybe we want to ask ourselves, where is the food grown that we eat in the city, and who is it that's working in these fields? In addition to the main CalEnviroscreen map, there's also indicator maps that show specific burdens on communities. And CalEnviroscreen has actually been used to inform laws to direct funding towards communities so that disadvantaged communities can be defined, categorized, and receive funding for projects due to this map. Unfortunately, the migrant farm workers, who are the main ones working in the Central Valley and experiencing these burdens, will probably not see any benefit from those laws. Another way of thinking about the way the nation state divides that. Some of the indicators used by CalEnviroscreen, there's 20 in all, and they're divided into these 4 categories of pollution exposure, environmental effects, socioeconomic factors, and sensitive populations. Something we haven't talked about so much so far is there are some human populations that are at greater risk of negative health impacts from poor air quality. So for children in particular, can have long-term impacts. Elderly, people with chronic illnesses such as asthma, and people who work in heavy industry, operating equipment, factory workers, truckers, they generally experience long-term exposure to air pollution and have the highest rates of illness and premature death. And through these indicators, they really show how social structures that discriminate against people of color and low-income people can determine our quality of life and even the air we breathe. I'm not going to spend too long on this slide, but we can see the way in which a raw value for each indicator is then converted into a percentile. Here we have the 2 for pollution burden, 2 for population characteristics, and those are then combined to give us an overall CalEnviroscreen score. I'm going to invite you all to explore the CalEnviroscreen interactive map now. It allows us to learn about different neighborhoods in terms of air quality and related indicators such as asthma, poverty, and many more. As I mentioned, this first map here, it's a composite, so a number of different indicators, including exposure to pollution and environmental hazards. And then the second 2 on the right here, they show individual indicators. And I'm going to walk you really briefly how to use that map now. Again, it's a heavy program and I have a lot of things open, so you'll have to bear with me. This is the main composite map. You can zoom in, zoom out. You can also use the search function. It's a little finicky sometimes. I recommend using zip codes. If you type in a zip code, it will usually come up, and don't just click enter. You actually have to click it. So if I was going to do, I'm living in Contra Costa at the moment, you have to actually click here to use that search function. You can't just type it in and click enter. You can also zoom in and zoom out on different regions and click on them individually and get a whole bunch more information about what's going on there. Just clicking one pretty randomly here, but encourage you all to explore the areas around where you live, maybe other places that you're just interested in. For example, I mentioned this Central Valley Coast Divide. But yeah, overall score, pollution burden score, population characteristic score, these are all conglomerate scores, so including many different indicators, and then the actual indicators that they're made up of, you can see here as well. You can also explore the indicator map. If you scroll down a little bit, it has a map for each specific indicator, and you can click on those to explore the map for that. Yeah, so we talked about 4 different tools, took us about 30 minutes. If you could each take around 10 minutes now to just choose one of these tools that you're interested in. If you want to check out more than one, that's fine with me as well. But yeah, take 10 minutes, explore one of those tools. After that, we're going to get into small groups, give a brief introduction of the tool you used, what you found, and maybe some discussion of the following questions. And I did want to point out, we do have some instructional guides or handouts for using these tools. We only have them for 2 of the 4 tools, But if you would like to have a little bit more of a guided experience rather than just clicking through on your own, if you'd like to answer some questions and be guided through that, more than welcome to use one of these handouts. We have one for the Good Life for All data set, and we have another one for the calendar screen. So if I could get some help sharing these tools and also these worksheets in the chat, I'm not sure if that's the best way to do it. Did also want to point out that a lot of links here, a lot of references. I was told this would all be shared with you at the end, so hopefully you'll have a chance to explore that in a little more detail if it's something that's interesting to you. Whew, sorry, that was a whirlwind.
Thank you, Alights. I'm working to share some of those links right now. They're coming up in the chat.